Weirding Way Media.
Welcome to episode 113 of the Filmmakers podcast. This is your host, Jamie Benning. If this is your first time listening, get ready for a great behind-the-scenes chat between me and my guest. And for regular listeners and all my patron supporters, thank you for sticking around. Your support makes each episode possible. It really does. If you like what you hear today, please consider supporting the podcast for just $12 for 1 year. That's basically like 50 cents per episode. And it would make a huge difference to me. It would be great if I could build up my Patreon following. It means that I could do this as my work. This is a lot of work to do. It's work that I love. But if you like it, it would be great if I could build up my Patreon following. It means that I could do this as my work. This is a lot of work to do. It's work that I love. But if you like it, consider helping pay for it if you can. Okay, so today it's my conversation with production designer Kevin Jenkins. Kevin started as a concept designer, and during his career he's helped craft some of the most visually memorable elements in franchises like Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, and Star Wars. Kevin and I talked about the films that shaped his childhood and early career, the impact of technology on the evolution of filmmaking, and the changing landscape of fandom over the years, as well as the collaborative nature of his work, the unique difficulties in maintaining the aesthetic continuity of those iconic franchises that I mentioned. And we also delve into some of his lesser-known work on films like The Edge of Tomorrow and World War Z, Kevin having had a big influence on certain aspects of the look of those films. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kevin Jenkins, production designer, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Kevin, what was the first film that caught your attention as a kid? Were you a moviegoer as a child?
Yes. I saw. There's a series of films because I was born at the end of the '60s, and I remember the '70s and its kind of strange yellow Kodachrome world, and there's a whole bunch of films that I know I saw at the cinema. Because some of them I still have the ticket stubs for, some of them the programs for, and they have almost, should we say, shaped my either love of film and my hope and want to have worked in it. I remember seeing, this is an eclectic bunch now, the films that I would say defined my journey forward were everything from Warlords from Atlantis, because back in the day, fantasy and sci-fi was a bit cheesy and crap, to be honest with you. I grew up watching, sort of black and white movies like, Flash Gordon and all that kind of stuff. So Warlords of Atlantis, because it kind of, I thought it was going to be Harryhausen, it wasn't. It's because I loved Land That Time Forgot, and that had been on TV, and Warlords of Atlantis came out. And then there are films like, I remember at the cinema seeing The Spy Who Loved Me and the parachute opening as Roger skied over the edge. That was hugely defining. Because it wasn't a certificate that anyone understood. I saw Jaws first time round in the cinema opening week as a kid, and there's certain scenes from that are burnt in my brain from the ABC Southampton, and I remember even where I sat at those times. I remember opening week of Star Wars, which was February '78. It was a Wednesday night, and I remember seeing that. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Black Hole. I was often just dumped at the cinema like we were as kids, and then sort of off you go. And so I would eat up as much genre as I could, but genre was far and few between back then. And so that kind of world really defined me, because as a kid, all we had on TV, pretty much for my love, was Star Trek was on a Tuesday night, and then there was Space 1999, and and of course, like a lot of people that maybe you've spoken to, from an artistic point of view, Star Wars was a huge shifting point where, for the first time, we had read in books like Foundation and other things had finally actually, for the first time, looked like science fiction. Because the only other films, because I actually saying another film that my mum dumped me at was 2001, which for a 7-year-old was like, what the hell am I sitting through? Probably the most, now I think it's the perfect film, but at the time, probably the most boring experience of my life. And so, but then I sit back and I go, my God, I'm glad I saw it, and all those kind of things. And so my lean back then was heavily genre, but that's because I could always draw and always wanted to be an artist, and the route and path to film and a career was just like, how the hell do you do that? And so, in a strange way, my initial thought was to be like a book jacket illustrator or something, because of Chris Foss and a lot of other artists that I was buying books for in the when I was about 10 years old, and just buying them for the covers, to be honest with you. And so that's kind of the mix of storytelling that I was involved in. I suppose storytelling, film, books, that sort of thing, and even radio. I still have the tapes upstairs from when I recorded Hitchhikers when it was on, or and it was released about 5 or 6 times. But I would stay up late on a whatever it was on Radio 4 and stuff. And so all those things is like you really had to, unlike now where there's a complete gut of genre and fandom, it was almost like an underground system where you had to hunt out what was, should we say, my interest. Obviously as I got older, I got interested in all films and all design and all sorts of things, but initially it was sparked by imagination.
Did this sort of love of going to the cinema and loving this genre stuff sort of go hand in hand with the development of your artistry? Were you coming home and drawing the things that you'd seen and writing about the things that you'd
Kind
seen?
of. I mean, for my O-level art, I've still got the picture upstairs in the loft, which is I literally almost copied a Frank Frazetta painting, which my teacher was very upset by. If you know Frank Frazetta's work, you know that
Yeah,
basically
the fantasy,
female
usually
nude
bare chested
fantasy
anal.
and stuff. And in a strange way, I was using it because I'd never seen art like that, and how to draw it and copy it. So it was, as I say, it was always an influence in the sense that I would buy books and things like, I had those original Frazetta books that they did in the block 1 to 4 that came out in the 70s, and I would just copy them. It's quite strange, and when you're that age, you don't really have a path; you just have a passion, and so it's just kind of. And I think my drawing passion wasn't quite linked to my film passion. I would go and see all sorts of movies many times. Whether it be Time Bandits or whether it be Raiders, Dune, Close Encounters. God, Richard Harris in, what was that Orca Killer Whale film he did? Anyway, but whatever came out that felt like it was adventurous, I would go for.
The Killer Whale movie, that was Orca, wasn't it? Was it
Was
Orca?
it just called Orca? I can't remember now. It was the Jaws rip-off that Richard Harris
It
did.
was the
Where
Jaws rip-off, because
basically,
wasn't I think that was a Benchley story as well, wasn't it?
it might have
I
been.
mean,
I,
it made
I just remember not caring because, in a strange way, after Star Wars came out, there was an Italian rip-off of Star Wars called The Humanoid that was utter tosh. But
yeah.
again, it's like, well, you wait 3 years for the next science fiction film, or you go see the utter tosh. And also, the naivety of it all back then was a lot more digestible. You could sit and just kind of let it wash over your head.
It's a real testament to those movies that you're talking about, though, Close Encounters, Jaws, Star Wars, all those things, that how good they are and how well they've stood the test of
Oh my
time.
God,
Because
Close
I think,
Encounters.
they're often blamed in a way of, oh, it's the start of the blockbuster revolution and we don't
Oh,
get art movies
God.
anymore. But
But what a
it's so difficult
revolution.
to make
Oh,
a film that
I
good.
love The Godfather. I love Barry Lyndon, and I love films. These are some of my
Yeah.
favourite films. But what I mean is like, I yearn for a 2001 to try and be made now. And what I mean by that is the, obviously Interstellar was, shall we say, I suppose, Christopher Nolan's self tribute to, 2001 in a way. but also like when I think about films like Close Encounters, and I kind of think about this often. I don't quite know how films like that could even be made now. A, because Close Encounters is like one of the most selfish films ever. How he literally goes, "I love aliens. I'm going to go and live with them and dump my family and kids at the end of it," which is an insane premise for a
Yeah.
movie. But
It wouldn't test
also,
anymore, would it?
yeah, but also in a strange way, one of the things that seems very different now as we've spread out into streaming and movies and all sorts of things like that, and different ways of entertaining through YouTube, is just the the strange perception shift, in my opinion, of the Hollywood star and what is a movie star. Because in a strange way, the world was a bit smaller back then, and there was just this amazing. As I go back and watch some of these films, you just look at some of the casts and you kind of go, "Oh my God, how did you pull that off?" and it's just a different tone, a different era. But there's a whole bunch of films that were made now that were just, I think very bold for the time, when people just took massive swings, especially end of the late 70s through the 80s, as we were talking earlier, going to see Predator again on the big screen last night. It's just like, I don't know how that film would get greenlit now as a standalone film if someone went and said, "I've got an alien movie and there's a guy and we're going to hire a muscly guy and he's going to run around in the jungle and stick mud on him," and and what I mean is like, you look at those eras of the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s, and you just think, "Good God!" It's almost like being with music in the 80s. You think, "Bloody hell!" To be alive at that time when creativity was pushing through a commercial system to come out like that, at that quality level, that's the thing I find amazing. Because the studio system is a studio system. You have to go and ask for money. Films aren't made for charity; they're made for money. We work in the film business, but to think that there was the clout, director, talent, faith, and those films came to us, and what's really weird is we're kind of still riffing off them now.
Yeah. Faith is the word, isn't it? I mean, another word that springs to mind talking about those early movies is the risk, the risk that they were taking. Joe Alves is a friend of mine. I'm actually making a documentary on Joe Alves and his production design. And
Yeah.
in fact, Kevin, I'd love to interview you for the documentary at some point, if possible. But just that idea of, okay, Stephen, let's build a 35-foot shark and put it in the real ocean. Just like, what studio now would go, okay, here's X
There's,
$million to go and do it.
it's quite strange how. Again, even watching Predator last night on the big screen, as I say, a film I've seen hundreds of times, but a film I hadn't seen on the screen since I saw it when it was first released in '87. And what was quite astounding was, it's hard to describe. What I mean is, the way that projects were made back then, we found other ways to make them through sometimes reasons of money, sometimes reasons of safety, sometimes reasons of this and that, which I completely understand. But it's quite astounding to see all those people literally blown up and put on fire and thrown from left to right, and to see it all, and it feels so authentic in a strange way, and processes have, as a filmmaker myself, some processes we do have shift massively in a positive direction, and I would say a whole bunch of processes have shifted massively in a direction that I think don't necessarily, should we say, they add, but they don't necessarily make better, I think, is the best way I can say it. Because because there are hoops that in this modern age we have to jump through that they would never have to have jumped through. Even filming on a jungle, that's like going to film in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, like when they did Jaws off the coast. These are, people try to find ways around doing difficult things now. It's quite astounding through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s that they just did bonkers things and go, "No, we're going to go and stand in the desert with David Lynch and film Dune," and everyone's going to
Yeah.
basically fall over through heat stroke or something. And then going to the jungle wherever they where they shot Predator, all the things. It's a kind of, to make it safer, we do tend to film things in a very different way now. but I do feel that compromise has allowed authenticity to be gone, as we found, should we say, what are easier paths to make it have made lesser results sometimes on screen.
Do you think then that with the advances in technology, with things like, what ILM calls stagecraft, the big volume and things like that, and these real-time engines, do you think there's going to be a point where, that authenticity kind of joins up with technology and we see things again
I think,
that are
I think you have
perhaps
to
more
remember,
believable?
I think, again, going back to your point, talking about Joe saying, I'm going to build a 35-foot shark or 25-foot shark and make it, and that's the process. The film business is now much larger than it ever was. And there's a lot of conflicting interests about sometimes, sort of, should we say, some things are made and promoted in a way that's not quite correct for the job, but people have interests to be able to kind of promote them because they, I don't know, let's be honest, generate income, generate a certain ownability to certain sort of parts of the process, things like that. And so I think we're still, as a business, trying to work out where technology sits comfortably, because it's quite strange. I've come from both sides of the spectrum. I've had a career in VFX, ILM, Frame Store, leading in sort of, quite high up in both of those companies. I've had a career in book jackets and games and all sorts of things, and I've had a career as a production designer that's freelance. And so the honest truth is, you can make a film completely faithfully the way that you made Jaws, and you have Jaws, and I would say that Jaws holds up today almost as perfect as ever, apart from a handful of shots that I could probably say is 4 or 5 shots that just look like complete crap, but the strength of the story takes you through it and you forgive it, but you could correct a few things, of course you could, but generally that's fine. Or you can have fun movies that do a version of that deep blue sea, and I don't believe the shark's even there, even though it's fun to see Samuel L. Jackson being eaten, and the films are, what shall we say, a bit of a dirty luxury. And there's been a lot of shark movies since, because it's quite cheap to make sharks in CG, not necessarily the water sims, but I would also say that, has anyone done a better job than Jaws since 1975?
Yeah.
I would argue not. And so when people say they can do things, yes, I suppose what I'm saying is you can do anything. You can do it practically and you can do it digitally. But I think it comes down to is like, how well do you actually do the whole thing? Because it's like, it's very interesting the way that technology is at the moment, because in a funny way, as someone that has to keep up with the trend of where we all are and what we see and everything else like that, I can honestly say that I don't think I've been, the last time I was truly blown away by something that was a technology twist that made me go, oh my God, I've never seen that before, was probably Davy Jones. And that was like 16, 17 years ago now.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
that's when, should we say, the perfect combination of care, love, time, money, play, whether it's achievable now in the current climate, I don't know, but all those things added together to do the job it should have been done, which is basically brilliant storytelling, fantastic performance, fantastic visual effects complementing, not taking over, or even though it was so prominent, it was all very much in service of the film rather than, shall we say, kind of doing other things. It's very interesting. I mean, and so technology doesn't necessarily always make things better or cheaper. Sometimes it's again, it's always a balance, but that balance comes through what people, I don't think, realize when they kind of go and they see movies, is that it's always a magic combination of events: a director, a producer, a studio, money, a production designer, the will, the passion, the time, And sometimes it's like a perfect storm that gives you those magic moments, such as Jaws or Davy Jones or other great moments you can think of. And other times, it's just a rush to get it out, and things go wrong or things aren't perfect. It's. I know I sound like I'm sort of moving around a bit, but it's not a black and white answer ever.
No, it's not. And I think one of the other elements, that is often talked about that didn't really exist with those movies that we've been talking about from the 70s and 80s is the sort of the fandom side of things where,
Fandom
so
is
much
massively different
expectation is
now.
to be managed. Nobody was sitting at home going, "Oh, I hope they make a good shark movie. If they don't make a good shark movie
No,
in the next
exactly.
six
In fact,
months."
you would go and get in a strange way. I would only know what movie was coming out by previews at the movie theatre. So you'd actually go early
Mm,
to go and see previews and go, "Oh my God, there's a film with Harrison Ford and he's wearing a hat and there's snakes in it. That's awesome. I'm going to go and see that." And so there was that. Plus, also, I think what's very strange, probably for people to realise now, is how low down the food chain fandom was in the 70s and 80s.
yeah.
If I went to school saying that I like to draw spaceships or something, I would probably get punched and beaten up. I remember I probably did
Yep.
actually, because it was a
Same.
very it was a very kind of almost like, oh, you're a nerd, you're a geek, get out of here. It's like, if you've seen the film Weird Science, that literally tells the truth. That's what it was like. It was almost like kind of, I know it sounds strange, it was like coming out almost. If I don't like football, I'm going to go
Mm,
draw a spaceship. And um and I think what's happened now is genre and has been so commercialized with expectation to live in these things. It's quite interesting because obviously, as I do a lot of I've done a lot of Lucasfilm projects, and people sort of
mm,
ask me, it's like, what's your favorite? What do you want to see next? All this kind of stuff, and it's like, and I have to remind people that I saw it first time round in '77, and I saw it in '80, and I saw it in '83. I personally like to see new and interesting and different, which is how I grew up, not knowing the difference between, Star Trek the Motion Picture. God, that was dull. Looked pretty. Wrath of Khan.
mm,
Wow, that's a story. And so, as far as like things go, it's like I never need to see Luke Skywalker ever again as long as I live. What I mean is, I did that in '77 and '80 and '83. It's like that story's been told. I do not need to. We now almost in fandom live in the past rather than look to the future. The future is almost scary to people and they can't accept
hmm
it, which is very strange. Whereas growing up in the 70s and 80s, I had to accept the future all the time. And even knowing back then, because I've still got all my kind of comics and magazines from that era, people said the same thing. Empire Strikes Back, what is this crap? This would never have happened. Oh, this is dull. He's not his father. Whatever. And so fandom hasn't really changed. But I think as in, they like to moan about everything. We all did. It
Yeah.
wasn't right. I think what has changed is the ability to accept the new. Because if we hadn't had that ability to accept new through the 70s into the 80s, we wouldn't have had, and the 90s, we wouldn't have seen our Total Recalls, our Starship Troopers. We wouldn't have seen, I don't know, even things like RoboCop and even Buckaroo Banzai or Space Hunter 3D Adventure in the Forbidden Zone. What I mean is people tried things and they weren't attacked for it. Some of it was
Mm,
successful, like now, but some of it wasn't. But everyone was just kind of like, yeah, that's a lesser version of Star Wars. But it wasn't like, oh, that's not as good as Star Wars. Space Hunter's rubbish. It's like, I hate everybody. You must all die. It was just never any of that thought process. And like people
no.
now put films on pedestals that, quite frankly, the thing bombed. Nobody
Yeah.
saw it. Blade Runner. I saw Blade Runner opening weekend with my brother in Bournemouth, ABC, and there must have been three other people and a dog in there. And I walked out as a 14-year-old going, that was probably the most attractive, boring dirge I've ever seen in my life because I was used to seeing Harrison Ford as Han Solo.
Same. Yeah.
And everybody has this rose tinted glasses that this classic was born. It wasn't. It was VHS that basically found it, and it's been retroactively 2001 actually wasn't really very well
Yeah,
received when it first came out.
yeah, yeah,
And so I think what's very strange is that's the beginning of a reaction in fandom to push an opinion forward that, quite frankly, seems more important than the actual thing, if that's a polite way of
yeah,
saying it. Do you know what I mean? It's like kind of,
yeah.
I don't know. I just watch things and go, "Oh, that was good," or "That was rubbish," and I don't feel the need to go and scream to anybody about it. I just kind of go,
No,
I just
but
thought,
al- also it's important, isn't it? I think to be able to have experimentation in film, and I wonder how we get away from derivative films. So many films and so many TV shows now are leaning on the films that we're talking about still. Is there a way to kind of escape those shackles, I wonder?
I mean, what's very interesting is because my daughter reads a lot of books. Is what used to be people purchasing and turning many books into movies and being the sort of
Mm,
the thought process, and even if they weren't taking the book, you can tell, I can point out exactly where Star Wars is ripped off from. I can point to the sections in Foundation and Dune and the Lensman series. You can even find the names of half the people, planets and stuff. And but we sort of, the faith in storytelling seems to have been diminished to give you kind of a comfortable version of storytelling sometimes. And if anybody tries anything different, it really upsets people. And so, and a lot of times we try it, and it's kind of covered up by memory, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. Which is what I mean is it's like basically homages to previous things rather than letting the story work. It is a fascinating time. I don't quite know why everyone's very scared of storytelling originality.
mm, mm. Just rewinding back, what was your first sort of moment breaking into the industry? Because you're an illustrator. I know you worked on like book covers, like you say, and I saw some of your game covers, some of which I knew quite well actually.
Yeah, I did a couple of famous
I
games.
work for I work for Formula One, by the way, as part of my
Um,
freelance work. So when
yeah.
I saw, was it
I
F1
did
Championship or
F17
F1?
Challenge. I did one called Overdrive.
Yeah,
I did another Formula One one as well. It was Screamers for Virgin Interactive, and I'm sure I did
yeah,
another one. Yeah.
yeah. But then you transitioned from that into the film industry. How did that come about?
I and again, I liken this to what people are feeling about AI at the moment. There are massive shifts that happen creatively over time. And the massive shift that I was involved with was learning how to paint, draw, illustrate, airbrush. And that's how I started my training and my career. But then the Apple Mac and desktop publishing and Photoshop 1.0 came in. And that fundamentally shifted the paradigm so massively to those that could use Photoshop and those couldn't. So some of the best artists I've ever seen in my entire life just died out within the space of 5 years because they couldn't move over
Yeah,
to using the new tools, 3D. And I'll be honest with you, the first 5 years of my 3D, 2D career, in even though I was working quite successfully, I'll be honest with you, it took all the fun out of being an illustrator because you literally were just making digital the. And the other problem was you tend to accept, because the computer's done it, it's really cool, that you think it's amazing because you've learnt a technique that's generated the amazing, but actually it's a bit shit when you look at it back and you kind of go, I remember I sort of did some, as I transitioned into learning 3D software and Photoshop, and I decided to not do an airbrush illustration for an advertising client and to try to do it in the computer, an old piece of software called Sculpt 3D in Photoshop. And I handed it over thinking I'd made this amazing thing because technically it was so hard to do. And they just phoned up and they just said, "You're fired. This is absolute crap. It's really the worst illustration we've ever seen. I can't believe we hired you. This is not like your work." And it made me realize
wow.
that you can get blindsided by computers and you can literally get enamored by the technique, which is kind of where we are with AI, the ultimate Russian roulette wheel of regeneration. And so what happened was I got a bit bored doing freelance illustration, and a friend of mine who was on the same agency as me that did book jackets, and he'd done some for like the Ben Elton covers, like Popcorn and stuff like that in
Oh
the early.
yeah, I remember those. Yeah.
A friend of mine, Paul, literally sort of pinged me, because the other thing is working at home, you sort of go mad on your own after a while, and you kind of go, I hate this. And so he pinged me and said, look, I've managed to get a job texturing, they're doing the Lord of the Rings movie, and I'm just going to go to New Zealand. And that left an opening at Frame Store, because someone else moved into that position and someone else moved on. And then I literally did some 2D Photoshop, 3D early camera projection samples and sent them off to them, and they go, how the hell did you do that? And I kind of had an interview and got in as one of the first texture painters on what was the Walking with Dinosaurs TV series, doing sort of sea monsters, walking
Yeah,
with
yeah.
dinosaurs. And back then it was so rare to find digital artists that could really do 3D and 2D. And so I started there, and I did a short time working for, sadly passed away now, Mike Milne, who headed up the team of Walking with Dinosaurs. I did a series of that, but then moved very quickly into digital environment work on film production, on Jonathan Frakes' Thunderbirds, who was the nicest man on planet Earth.
Really.
No one can take anything away from Jonathan Frakes. One of the best directors I've ever worked for. Absolutely cool. Just
Nice.
amazing time. And yeah, and then just basically kind of like moved on into digital environment work and doing shots. And that was when, again, I would like to call that, possibly compared to today, which is much more factory almost based in scale. It was like probably the golden age of visual effects, where how to do things like a tree was actually really hard and almost like a problem to be solved, like mountain climbing and climbing Everest. And now you can do anything, literally anything. But when I was first doing 3D and 2D and matte painting, and even that was at the time when matte painting was transitioning from glass, and I was one of only about 3 or 4 matte painters in London at the time. Now there's hundreds all over the place, but it was.
Did you ever do it on glass, by the way? Or
No, I never did. No, I mean, I obviously I could paint normally, but working for Framestore, which was a digital film company, it was literally they
Yeah,
were
of
at the
course.
cusp of trying to promote new things, and so I have thought about having a go. I've tried most old school things on the films I've done, but glass matte painting is particular art that quite sadly there's hardly anybody that has the ability and knowledge to probably even have a go now, let alone the time and money. Because there are certain things that, look, I wanted to be in the film business through people like Chris Evans and Frank Ordaz and Mike Pangrazio and all those artists at ILM, but
Yeah.
in a strange way, it's a double-edged sword. Some things are better in a certain respect to be done in the computer because they are more straightforward. But I will still say that when I look at some of those old matte paintings, I have to say that I kind of even sometimes look at, even in Star Wars, and you look at some of the matte paintings in many films through the day. And in fact, there was one in Predator when they were crossing the bridge, and before Billy cuts his chest. And I kind of prefer them. I think there's a certain thing that I love about them, where
There's a
they're not.
charm.
There is a charm, but also I will say in some other respects, the painterly loose aspect to them, because it was all shot on film grain, very raw back then. In some cases, I'd actually say they work better than a completely clean digital thing.
Yeah.
It all depends what
Yeah.
you're trying to achieve. I mean, not all films have to be photorealistic and art, but it's
Yeah.
no,
I was chatting to Jet Green just the other day, who
Ah, yeah,
worked with
yeah,
Frank and Mike
yeah.
and Chris, and she's still painting now, and she is living in Maui, and she's working for a little gallery and painting still. And she was saying that some of her paintings are like 6 foot by 4 foot, and people are saying to her like, "Oh, from a distance it looks amazing and photorealistic, but when I get up close it's quite rough." And she was like, shit, I'm still matte painting, I'm still,
Yeah,
because obviously with some of those early matte paintings, you only had to do what you needed to do for the camera at
but
the
that
time,
and
and
that
she sort of, yeah,
But no, you just said the most important thing in film business, which is everything you do is for the shot, the camera, and exactly what you need, no more, no less. And in a funny way, sometimes and that was the mantra of all filmmaking. But digital provides a flexibility for people to change their minds, a bit like the way that people use Photoshop. I always remember talking to certain people the way that we use Photoshop still. Now, I used to use Photoshop when there were no layers and just revert and no undo. And even now, I don't use adjustment layers. Where people go, well, it's a bit, it's not do or die. It's just like, that's what I want to achieve. And I don't wither or change my mind. That's what we're trying to do. And so I think the more we introduce tools that create doubt, sometimes they do provide better options, but other times they produce a multiple of indecision. And sometimes, and I think, that's another interesting aspect of, I think there's many things that have affected the film business, in the sense that there is more choice, and in some respects it's made better films, and in other respects I think it's made worse films, because sometimes it all depends on the person and their clarity of their vision or what they need. And here's the interesting thing I think about the film business is, like, literally everybody works completely differently. Everybody, the way I work, the way other designers work, the way that Doug Lyman works compared to the way that Ryan Johnson works, it's all chalk and cheese, and so there's no right or wrong. That's what I find very fascinating about the business. But I do think that sometimes some films that we have made in the last 15 years would never have probably been possible 30 years ago. And that's not just because the technology wasn't there, because I think the chaos would not have been allowed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wonder about that kind of the way technology has kind of driven us apart to a certain extent. It's like one of the things that Jet was saying is that when she first worked at ILM in the optical era, she was in the same room as Mike Pangrazio and Chris Evans and Frank Ordaz, and then when they went to digital, they were in a booth,
Yeah.
and they were isolated from each other. So she couldn't sort of lean back and say, "Hey, Mike, does this shadow look right on this
It's one of the
cliff
very
for the flood
reasons
scene in
why
Temple of Doom?"
it's one of the reasons why I moved on from visual effects, because it went from being very small teams. If I think of the size of teams I worked on doing either Superman Returns or Alien versus Predator or other, or even Beyond the Sea, whatever the film was, they were very small teams, and we took ownership over big chunks, and you crafted them together. And the difference now, I think, is through the necessity of scale and speed, is that those teams have now become, shall we say, like car plants. They've been kind of, shall we say, factoryized in a way, if that's even a word. And I think one of the things is that I almost realised that, for me personally, visual effects was becoming an insular solo hobby again. Like I was, even though you worked in a big company, much like when I was a freelance illustrator, rather than a collaborator. And so that's why I kind of gravitated to when I first met, or when I first started accidentally creating London's first VFX art department, which was to try to meet and work with directors and other production designers to try to kind of, should we say, be more creative and collaborative, because VFX was on the cusp of turning into a larger thing. Because like when I joined Framestore, I think there was only like 60 people in film, or even less, or less, maybe 38 or something. I don't know, not very many. And and as I said, everybody was like, it was like everybody was a Maradona, for those old enough to know football. But anyway, everyone was a Maradona or a Pele or something like that. And now, like everything, naturally, the scale of things means that you have to kind of find a way of the system to equalize things, and that can be across the board. But that to me was less interesting. To other people, it's interesting, but actually less interesting to stop working that way. And so I kind of then switched into doing concept art on, what was the project that we accidentally did? There was something happened. There was some downtime at Framestore. We were in between shows, because back then, we did 2 films a year, it was considered a really busy year. And I remember there was this 3 or 4 month gap between projects, and in that time, working with William Sargent, who ran Framestore at the time, was just to kind of go, well, let's just see if we can I don't know, change the perception, and so I started doing some conceptual art just to try to help on projects. And then what happened was the art was taken by the VFX supervisor down on set on Prince of Persia to a production designer called Wolf Kroger, who did Blood and The Edge and lots of very cool films. And he was doing Prince of Persia, and they needed someone to work out how to do this very complex, at the time, sand room sequence where Jake Gyllenhaal sort of slides down sand as the whole thing collapses at the end.
Oh, yeah.
And so, because I knew obviously VFX, matte painting, digital environments, I just started doing concept art, and Wolf asked me to go down. So I spent about 6 weeks in the art department with Wolf Kroger, and some art directors, and all of a sudden my eyes were opened. But like, oh wow, this is the real film business. More real in the sense that the real version of the film business, not the digital version of the film business. And I got the absolute bug for being kind of, should we say, on set and being at the beginning of the creativity point. And so I took that back and then finished that sequence, and then continued. The people at studios at that point, at least the point people in visual effects, would then push me on to either directors or to other producers, and I would sort of develop things. And that's kind of how I started my art direction career.
I often think about like concept artist versus like a production designer or art director, where as a concept artist you've got this sort of, obviously you've got the restrictions and the remit of, you know, the art department telling you what they're looking for, but you don't have to think about physical construction necessarily when you're doing that concept art.
Kind of, because
Do
everything in
you?
business comes a bit. I mean, obviously, there's imagination storytelling, and you can do anything you want with money these days. But it all depends on, again, what the director and everybody wants. And what's very unusual is when I started doing conceptual art, most production designers could actually, you know, like I sat next to Stuart Craig, who did this best sublime pencil. Norma Reynolds could draw, John Barry could draw. Many of them were exquisite draftsmen. And I don't mean draftsmen in the technical sense, I mean in the rendering sense and stuff, whether it be pencil or the Ken Adam version. But now I'm almost, in a funny way, slightly alone in kind of, I'm one of the few that I find can actually draw and communicate in this way now, because the system has sort of slightly changed a lot. And so what inspired me was when I was working with these production designers was, oh, they just do a little thumbnail or something like that, and you would then go away and do that. And I've had to change even the way I concept when I work with directors now, because the scale of productions these days and the speed, I obviously need to work with some concept artists as well, because there's not enough time in the day to do everything. But also there's a massive misnomer of what even concept art even is. The word is loosely used to just about anybody that does a digital painting these days, and that's not really what concept artists do. All the I would say 95% of the concept artists I see are probably illustrators, and the 5% that are concept artists, but people don't really know the difference. So, you know, concept artists solve design problems and create ideas, and there's a whole illustration side that's almost replaced what book jackets were, which is doing lovely keyframe art of a castle on a hill. It's, you know, and you know, and also because it's kind of, it was never done this way. If you think that all of these amazing films, and even I will use the word Star Wars, you know, there was art done to help as illustrations in the process. People have become very used to concept art now, but really up until about 10, 12 years ago, it was just a kind of like it was not that much a part of the process. All the big films that we all love from a massive original design point of view for the last 50 years up until about 2010 had hardly any concept art. You know, it was kind of like, you know, a few drawings here or draftsmen there and a few bits in the corner and stuff like that. But now there's volumes of like almost overindulgence in just producing art for art's sake now that no one ever looks at. It's quite funny. It does make me laugh, the amount that, God, I can tell you the amount of pieces we've done on Star Wars projects that no one's ever seen.
Yeah. When you're doing that sort of concept work for something like, I don't know, Rogue One or Edge of Tomorrow, you did some creature design and stuff on that, didn't you? Um, is that getting critiqued amongst your colleagues, or is it just your boss that's kind of critiquing and coming back at you?
It sort of works very differently. Like Edge of Tomorrow is an interesting one because Christofaria, who was the head of visual effects at Warner Brothers at the time, brought me on
Mm.
even before the production designer Ollie Scholl was on to meet Doug Lyman and do some work. And I did about 8 weeks before him. And that the problem they had was very specific back then because again, visual effects was expensive and complicated. And they said we have an exosuit problem and we have an alien problem. And so I spent 18 months almost. I was communicating and working with Ollie Shaw, but mostly with Nick Davis, who was the VFX suit via Doug Lyman, which was like solve the problem of these two fundamental things and solve the problem of the exosuit, and then that went off and became the exosuit and got manufactured, and then spent about 18 months solving the alien. And that was very different to the way things happen now. There were two projects that had that very particular, almost independent way of working. The other one was World War Z, which was when I first met Mark
Yeah.
Foster, and we did a pitch to him, and they literally said, "Oh, we've got this. I've read the book, and it's cool. How are you doing it?" Say, "Yeah, we got zombies, but we don't really know what to do with them." And so, what was very interesting was coming up with that original, so we say, zombie idea. Which, because I remember after working for about 8 or 9 weeks, and I said to Mark Foster, "I don't think I can come up with a zombie because they're just dead people." And it was like, "Oh shit, we're just Paramount making a lot." And so I said, "But maybe we can come up with something with lots of zombies." And he said, "What do you mean?" And we had this two bits of footage at the time. One of them was some rats pouring out of a door because of something. Because again, this is pre-YouTube, so
Yeah.
or YouTube was different then. And then the second one was an old frame store ad of them making a Guinness Castle of Men to get a pint of beer, an ad that was very famous, I think, in the early 2000s. And so that became the seed to go, what if we make a fluidic body of zombies? And that was how all the design concept art went. So the poster, which is actually zombie bodies pulling a helicopter down, is actually some of the concept art we did to kind of explain the process. But I remember the very first meeting when we actually thought we had an idea, and Colin Wilson, who was the producer at the time, came round, and they brought Mark round, and I just printed out literally, it was like after doing that 5 weeks work, I think we had like 5 paintings. And so all I did, and they were all trying to like use the inspiration of turning a wave or a real flood, but replacing that with their bodies, which is what we did. And they were all just black and white. And because I only had five, we just got the art department the plotter printer that they used to do all the spreadsheets on massively at Framestore, and we just printed them out about like kind of 8 foot wide. And so they walked to the room, there was just these five massive pictures, which was to fill the void of not having any other ideas. But it worked because they saw it theatrically, and they both went, "Oh my god, we've never seen this before." And they, because it was like body like a crest of a wave or splashing up on top of each other and stuff, and they saw the potential of it. And so I stayed. It was very frustrating on one level, brilliant on another. Worked with 18 months with Mark and was brought into all sorts of strange meetings I've never thought I'd be brought into to kind of go, would they have done this, and what's the end going to be? And that was another story. But frustratingly, never got any credit for it because I worked for a VFX vendor who didn't even do the VFX. And one of my big frustrations back at that time was not being recognised for the amount of design work done on some of those shows back then, when you're
Yeah.
contributing large aspects to the story. And
Yeah. Well, I have to say both those examples you just gave, World War Z and Edge of Tomorrow. World War Z in the trailer where you see that sort of fluid wave of zombies trying to climb up a wall or something. That was the moment in the theatre watching the trailer when my friend and I turned to each other, and I said, not for me, because I hate zombie movies because it looked terrifying. And he turned to me and said, "Fuck yeah!"
I
So
mean, well, yeah, but none of that was ever as a written thing. You know, the
yeah,
idea that
yeah,
they did that
interesting.
was added to it, and that's the same almost like in a strange way for the mimics in Edge of Tomorrow, whereas in the art department of
That
Rain.
was a brilliant design, by the way. I don't know how much was that your original
So,
concept. Do you know
well,
what it
there's many.
reminded me of?
Look, I've got 1,000 versions of that mimic all over the place, and it became a combination of
Yeah,
people just bouncing over each other to get to the end. But where it truly came from was see, I can always bring out the where it all came from, which other people can't because I was there when it all came from. And so, even though many people had a go at bits and bobs at them, what changed that was because again it was draw alien of the week and we did this, and then there was this one piece of reference that was found on Vimeo of a commercial, and it was like a piece of sound reference mixed with early CG, and it was like this small cube, and it had this almost pumping soundtrack that would make these almost like the Prodigy like noises here and there, and this cube literally then shot out tendrils to the music that almost like spikes, and it
right.
kind of and that became the initial violence of their motion mixed with a sculptor that had been making sculptures of lions and things made out of tires, and so literally we kind of
Interesting.
combined the two to make this kind of, I can only describe it as this exploding noise of black rubber, which is what the
Well, this
mimic.
is a, do you know, I've got written here, I just want to, sorry to interject, I've got written here, it reminds me of when a tire bursts in Formula One,
Yeah.
firstly. And the second thing it reminds me of is if a helicopter crashes and the rotors start digging into the ground and like terrifyingly coming at you, like in
So
Black Hawk Down or
that was
something
the
like that.
beginning. And again, Nick Davis, who was the VFX suit, did a wonderful job taking that on forwards. But all those initial conception points were done when I started that art department at Frame Store and actually promoted these ideas and did the early artwork, just like we did on World War Z, that then started the journey that other people, should we say, built upon. But that's how those original, because again, it was just written mimic, and at that time everyone was going, "I'll just draw a creature," and we had all sorts of things. We had hexagon creatures. We had, oh god, I literally, I'm not, as I said, I've got 1,000 versions of a mimic in a folder, 936 or something. But
That film doesn't get as much love as it should, I think. I think there's some
no, it's a
great
very
moments in that film.
complicated film in the sense that I remember. I mean, it's got 5 titles. I can't remember which one they actually released anymore. We
Yeah.
started when it was called We Mortals Are. Then it was the book All You Need Is Kill. Then it was anyway.
And then the marketing went all live, die, repeat, didn't it? And
But
yeah,
even the film had a journey to find the film. And so it was a very, very hard film to make, and I think even Doug Liman's gone on record saying it was a very difficult film. It was a very difficult film for us to come up with the exosuit and then the alien, and it was a difficult film across the board to make and find in the edit because having a time loop is like almost impossible to shoot, and it basically and and also in a funny way, even Tom Cruise accepting a role that had to go through a journey, because Tom Cruise in all Tom Cruise films is being Tom Cruise, and he
yeah,
had to almost, should we say, be a bit rubbish and a bit of a jerk at the beginning and learn how to be Tom Cruise, which I think also naturally fought against the process as we were making it. So I think there's many versions of why that was, and so he becomes Tom Cruise again through that. But I think that through the edit was a huge thing to find, and it was a very, very complicated. It's a bit like, my understanding is that I think Doug Liman had a difficult time making The Bourne Identity as well, which is just like
yeah.
sometimes you've just got to push through it. And I think that Edge of Tomorrow is one of those films that we just had to push through. Like World War Z was the same as well.
And then when you arrived working on Rogue One, I mean,
I
you
didn't.
talked about
So I didn't
seeing.
do the bit worker. So I was on the Force Awakens as an art director.
Oh, you're on the Force Awakens.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll start that again
So basically, how I got to that point was, I the journey is that I, through my frame store art department,
then.
ended up being invited to go and work with Rick Carter, Steven Spielberg's production designer, on Warhorse.
Yeah.
Rick and I became close friends, and I worked in Rick's office, and that, should we say, gave me a strange access to a world I didn't know, which was meeting Kathy, working with Janusz Kaminski, and having curries every day, lunch with them, because Rick had become obsessed with curries at that time, because, being an American and being introduced to British curry. And so after that, I did some work with Rick independently on Lincoln, to help solve some or promote some ideas of some dream sequence stuff. And one thing Rick taught me was a huge amount about story and film production, as well as the design. And then what happened was, when Force Awakens started, I literally got a mail from Rick going, "Oh, I know you're at Frame Store, but if you know any other artists that want to come and help us on Star Wars, that would be wonderful." It's like, oh God. So then I kind of ended up talking to ILM, resigned from Frame Store, which was a very difficult wrench at the time because I created their art department. Moved over and started up ILM London, but instead of working at all at ILM for my whole time I was there, I was asked by Bad Robot to go onto set as an art director on The Force Awakens, and pretty much started day one on trying to solve the third act stuff for Rick, while they were trying to solve Darren was trying to solve the first act, Rick was trying to solve the locations, and he just went, "We've got this problem. Can you read the script and break down the third act and put the pieces together?" Because again, the problem was time. We were, as all films are running out of time. Everyone thinks that, films are like train timetables. They work perfectly. They're just utter chaos, like making a painting where you think you have an idea and then you scrape it off and start again because it didn't quite work. And so I then started working on the third act sets, which were all of the oscillator stuff, all of the Han Solo stuff at the end, anything involving the First Order Empire world. And so I kind of then broke down initially from JJ's scripts what we needed. Because what most people maybe don't know about some projects is you do enough to get the first act going, have a good idea of the second act, and then while they're filming the first act, you're working on the third act. It's because it's time. And so, and in this case, presented back the third act to JJ and started working on how all those sets would work and designs and combination of concept art direction, all that kind of stuff. And I then pretty much stayed. I was the only Lucasfilm employee from the art side to be on Pinewood stage for the shooting of the 3 trilogy films, and sort of I was the through line for those 3 films. Moving from art director, I was the first Lucasfilm design supervisor because I fought for and created that title with lots of many arguments with them, and that was asking for recognition of the amount of design work that was done on Last Jedi, and then became the production designer on Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, but working on a Star Wars movie, you talked about, like, you saw it in February '78 when you were a kid. Was it a kind of dream come true to work on something like that, or does it feel like I guess the question I'm asking is, you've got this sort of ability to solve a problem of an alien on the the edge of tomorrow, but with the Star Wars movie, you're already kind of hemmed in to a certain extent, and you're inspired by Norman Reynolds and Ralph McQuarrie and Joe Johnson and all those things.
Depends which time period you've done. It was very difficult on the Acolyte because there was no time period to riff off of. But I think what's interesting is I had never drawn even an X-Wing fighter before I worked on Star Wars, right. So I came at it with I was not a fan art, I'd loved the original movies, and came at it as a design problem, and then realized how hard it is. And what I think people must know, because what's really strange is even now in my career, getting people to see past the amount of Star Wars I've done is quite difficult. But from a design point of view, Star Wars is actually the hardest subject to try to do, especially whether you can or cannot draw, because it is literally like trying to work in the style of a famous artist that has no rules or explanations and is literally done on hunches. And so people think it's very easy and done on rails, but I will say this about nearly every other production. if I did a film on ancient Rome, or if I did a film on castles or horror, I can go and buy a book on Gothic architecture, or I can look at castles, or I can go to a country house, or I can buy a lawyer's office contemporary book, and then that's how art direction works. You build the story there. I can honestly say that there was nothing for Star Wars. And there was nothing when we did it, in the sense that literally we had to kind of try to figure it out based upon what had gone before. How do you be new when you need to hold on to the old? And so from a design point of view, it's incredibly difficult, and many people, both concept artists and from other perspectives, fail massively. It's very, very hard to keep on the rails, and on that respect, it's incredibly challenging and rewarding because it's incredibly creative. But people think that it's given to you, and you kind of just as a designer go, well, I'll just stick a thing there. But what they don't know is that as one of the, should we say, the actual conceptual designers of modern Star Wars since 2013, I actually have to come up with all of it on the projects that I do. And so, and it's really hard because there are no books. Macquarie has been milked to death. You can't use it anymore. It's gone. And so you have to work out where else to get your ideas from, but make them still look like an artist that sadly has passed away, that never drew any of these things after 1982.
Yeah, yeah, and there, you're right. There's almost a feeling where you can say that doesn't look like Star Wars, or that does
Completely.
look like Star
But
Wars,
you,
or
but
it
but
fits or it doesn't fit.
you don't have those problems when you're doing a Gothic castle, or a 20s New York street, or a 1890s London. It is or it isn't. But Star
Yeah.
Wars is that, but with no guidebook, and everyone just going, well, this doesn't feel right, and then someone has to go, well, I'll do this to make it feel right. It is incredibly difficult, and the one thing I do find frustrating is being judged upon Star Wars as if it's like kind of, I don't know, easy. And to be
And
honest,
there's a template in place. Yeah.
there is zero, there is nothing, and it's really, really, really hard.
Yeah, it's the sort of the difference between having like this aesthetic continuity in that, particularly in
Yeah.
those sequel films to the original films and the prequels, but versus like you say, historical accuracy on something like like you say, like a castle movie or
Yeah, I
something.
mean,
I mean, they pose their own challenges, right? But very
everything
different.
poses its own challenge, but fundamentally, as I said, and I'm not belittling any other production design of finding. I mean, all production design is hard, but I'm just saying that certain large-scale visual effects problems, not visual effects, blockbusters that involve huge amounts of creativity, if you want it to make it original, are literally as an artist that draws, it's the hardest subject. And even to say, why does Star Wars look different to every other sci-fi? Because here's my example. We made Star Wars, I believe, look like Star Wars through hell or high water on the projects I've done, and everyone really thinks it looks like Star Wars. But if I didn't have to work that hard, it could look like generic mush sci-fi movie on any other channel, number five, because now we are not in an era of the late 70s and 80s where if I quote you Star Wars, Alien, 84 Dune, Flash Gordon, Tron, Blade Runner, all those films are completely individually designed with an identifiable world building process that I have not seen the like of since that time. And now a lot of sci-fi just looks like sci-fi, and AI exacerbates that sort of detailed, noisy,
Yeah.
mushy, none look. But Star Wars, so it doesn't look like that, still looks like Star Wars. And so that is the trick of trying to even design those projects for Lucasfilm, which is to try to keep it away from, because I know all those other subjects, I've even designed on them. And even, and I would say that most sci-fi these days struggles to find its own identity.
Well, working on the Acolyte then, poses sort of another layer of problems because you're trying to make it look like Star Wars, but you're going into an era of Star Wars that's yet to be seen. What
Yeah.
kind of things did you kind of lean into on that? I mean, obviously, I sort of like from my perspective, I see inspiration from like but the early Buck Rogers, the sort of serials and
Loads of
stuff.
that.
It
Yeah,
feels
it
like
was. So, so,
yeah,
so again, I kind of, again, we had this discussion earlier about people really struggling to accept new and needing comfort food to move forward. And I had to kind of make it feel like there was a veneer of comfort food, but quite frankly, I had nothing to work with. The only thing I did place or I did have was some of the sets that they had made in the prequels. One room in particular. But I also, because of the director showrunner decision to want to use completely practical sets, I I aged it in the way that I'd aged Jurassic and Star Wars and other films I've been on very heavily to try to give it a sort of a much more, in my opinion, a much more kind of worn, used version of what it was. And so, but leaving that one design that was from another project, everything else kind of, had to go off and sort of go, this is completely new city, but, or new look, and we've got to make it not feel like the sequels and the prequels because we're a different time period. And I did that mostly with a lot of color, which probably made people noticed
yeah,
on the show. The one that, I banned a whole bunch of colors and where, and that was a conscious decision because if I had used grey and black and white and brown, because current Star Wars seems to have a lot of the most important planet in the galaxy seems to be Tatooine, which was not the most important planet when we started in 1977, and all of that war era is those grey military colours, the very stark, because like 2001 is essentially a rip off of, sorry, Star Wars is essentially a 2001 pastiche with dirt. And so
yes.
all the white and black sets with dirt. And so I just basically had to make a conscious decision to avoid all of those and to try to see how far I could push the colour and get the DOPs on board with that and see how that would kind of go. And it was also a very challenging show for a number of reasons. The time period and the shooting over in winter and where we were and all sorts of production issues that kind of, shall we say, made it a sort of just a real juggle to try to keep it all going.
When you're working on a show like that, or any of the films that we've talked about, how closely are you working with the costume department? Because I often think that, the setting has to interact with the costuming and it has to work with it and it has to not be jarring. But they're two
Sometimes,
sort of
yeah.
separate departments. I know they're under the art department still, but
Well,
yeah, how does that
sometimes
work?
not at all.
Mm.
Apart from a hi, that's cool. Okay, we're doing a red stormtrooper. But on the acolyte with Jennifer and her team, there was a lot of communication because what is quite fascinating about that project was if you took out the lightsabers and the Jedi robes, there's no Star Wars in the whole project, fundamentally.
Mm.
And so she almost had the same problem. So her Coruscant was her Jedi outfits, and my Coruscant
Mm.
was Coruscant, and everything else was new. And so she would get an idea of what colours were coming up in the sets and things like that to be able to kind of try to
Mm.
help kind of guide some of her costume choices and stuff. So rather than work together, it's more like inform because we're all working so fast, so hard, and so
Yeah.
long that really it's more like you get a request and you just basically show people and you just kind of go, this is where we are. Can you change it?
Mm.
That's going to be yellow. And the way, generally it works. Apart from there was only one thing that really popped up was where there was a misunderstanding about how long the corridors had been made for when the Nemoidian puppet that had come back out from walking through the ship, and they had these hats that were
Yeah.
very tall, and we worked out the head and the hats would even fit in the corridor, and it was like, can you make the set taller? It's like, can you give me $500,000?
Yeah.
Let's
Wow.
make the hats smaller. So it's just, but apart from that, you communicate as best as you can at the time.
Yeah, we were talking earlier, weren't we, about just the sort of complexities and the time frame and everything else. I think people don't understand what an unwieldy beast these big productions are. I've worked on big live TV productions, and I'm amazed sometimes we get on air.
Yeah, no, and I think that's the apparent thing is like it kind of, you know, we're not sat around drinking coffee for a year trying to work it out. It's like, the only analogy I can use is almost from day one is the art department, because production design and the art department is very misunderstood, and what it actually does. And without any art department or production designer, yes, you could make a project, but it would have no through line at all, and it would be literally, without the art department, you don't even know where the location is. Without the art department, you don't have a set. Without the art department, you don't have a look for anything, because everything starts there at that core. And in a strange way, I do feel over the last 10 or 15 years that kind of, as movies have got more complex to make, sometimes everyone's taken a bit of a stab at the art department and the production designer roles and try to have a bit of a land grab with, you know, I don't know, other departments. Well, this is the concept we did of a castle. This is what we're going to do. It's like that does not fit in our world, because in a strange way, the production designer is one of the few people that has the constant through line with the director to understand the nuances of the story of why, for example, Ryan wanted a throne room with a red curtain in The Last Jedi. Do you know what I mean? It's like, that conversation only happened to a few of us because it was part of the whole story concept. And so, and other people will go, well, I'll just do a green one. It's like, no, it can't be. It has to be this. And there's very specific reasons. And so, and that's one of the issues as a production designer, where kind of, other departments, whether it be, SFX or visual effects, obviously want the information an art department feeds, but sometimes does its own thing and can be very, very frustrating because it can dilute the overall story vision, which sometimes when you're doing, and it's not really particularly anybody's fault, sometimes the scale of the projects is just so enormous that you don't get to design everything. Now, luckily, being an ex-concept VFX artist on Jurassic, like, with Colin, he, I work, we designed the dinosaurs in the art department because we wanted them to look right on the sets. So I would sit there with ZBrush and Colin, and we'd be pulling around Giganotosaur heads and all sorts of things. And that was a complete, through line of the art department all the way through, working with the very wonderful Dave Vickery, VFX supervisor on that one. But, and other times it can be, I've just been to the cinema and I don't know where that third act thing came from, and it can be quite interesting or frustrating, or sometimes it's better, sometimes it's. But what I mean is like, again, nobody really understands the art department. It's a very complex subject, from production design, art department, and even the politics of film sort of discussion.
Yeah.
Because it's a very difficult subject, and I'm trying to find the right words to, from one perspective, might seem very straightforward, but I also know I've been on the other side of the fence and seen the other perspective, is what I'm saying. So it's a balanced conversation. So this is a very difficult subject to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. One of the nice quotes I got from Joe Alves was, he was talking to Rod Serling one day saying, how do you come up with these ideas for the Twilight Zone and Night Galley? You're amazing. And he said, Joe, I just write the words, you make them happen. And I really like that, because the production design and art design departments are kind of misunderstood. And I think, when you look at it in that sense, like when Joe took those galley sheets of Benchley's book for Jaws and drew the first images from those words, I mean, that's the first time somebody has
I
expressed
think
visually.
the production designers I've worked and been inspired by have been ones that want to, and I'm going to use the word, people can misconstrue this as being controlling. I want to use the word protect the vision, because I sign on to a project for a long time, and my job is to help bring the fruition of the design and the management and the production of that process visually through to when I'm off the show. And our film business works in weird ways now, whereas again 20 years ago you'd be a production designer, you'd work on the show, and then you'd come to the end of production and then it'd be edited and released. Now we have a post-production period where all sorts of things can change and be redesigned and be redone, and that can be quite it can be quite hard sometimes to get enough done to help those other processes, because again, production timescales have come down from 3 years to 1 year now, and or 2 years or something for a massive film, and it all goes to, I think, if we're not careful, dilute some things. And I've been very lucky on the three projects I've done to do as much as the post-production conceptual work as the pre-production conceptual work, because all of the ship's vehicles and sort of the environments in the Acolyte were all developed in the art department, and I would say the same for Jurassic as well, where literally there were no unanswered questions. Now, of course, the director has complete prerogative to go, yeah, we had a great time with Kev, but I bloody hated his work and I wanted to change that in post. That's fair enough, I get that. But if the relationship works and it's good, then I think the production designer's job is to design the production. And that may involve, I have experience of designing creatures, I've experience of designing spaceships, I've experience of designing all the post-production and stuff, but we're now slightly splintered, and I do wish that one thing was a bit truer, which is I wish visual effects understood production and the art department a bit better, and I do realise I wish the art department understood VFX a bit better, because they are two very different worlds that do not understand each other very well.
What do you think the key is then to moving in that direction? Is there any
I
steps that can be
I,
taken?
I actually don't think there is a solution, and I think it's too complicated, because art departments are set up very differently to visual effects facilities. Visual effects facilities are companies. Art departments are an individual group of artists brought together for a project. And so they almost fundamentally don't even work in the same way. So in a visual effects facility, everybody uses the pipeline and the piece of software that flows through to give you a result. In an art department, you don't want to limit people, so I don't care whether we make a model, a white model, I don't care whether we make a clay model, I don't care whether it's made out of paper mache and toilet rolls, I don't care whether they use AutoCAD, Vectorworks, Maya, blah, blah, blah. So that's the problem, where there's little conformity in the art department, and because it will always be that way to be able to function, because the one thing an art department can do more than anything I've ever seen is solve a problem in an insanely small amount of time and still deliver. And I've never, like any other business I've seen, film production, because of the nature of its guerrilla workforce, is incredibly flexible. And so some of the things, like, for give you an example, we were working on Jurassic, we were shut down because of COVID, like everybody else. We were the first show back out of COVID. And I stood on the Bond stage, and Colin came up, and it was like, Colin, I've got a plan B, because I don't think we're going to be going to Malta. And that plan B is to turn this set around that you're stood in now, which was the underground dino market, into another piece, because what you were doing in Malta, which was when the Raptors escaped before they chased Chris Pratt, was actually all to happen in a town square. We couldn't go to the town square, and the VFX costs were so enormous to recreate the town square, we decided to go, well, let's take the set we have, and over the course of 3 weeks, we'll make a completely new world, which became an underground boatyard, or a boatyard that looked out to the sea. And that was done in a matter of 3 weeks from start to scratch. And that's what I mean, is the power of the ability to change a massive set the size of the Bond stage into something new is where the power of the art department really lies.
Yeah, having a very flexible workforce. And
Yeah, once you've got the staff, you can use that workforce to make miracles incredibly quickly.
is there a particular director you've worked with where you really feel like it was a meeting of minds, like you almost can finish each other's sentences? And
I don't know if it's ever like that. I do like to think that as an artist, I try to have a relationship with directors through drawing, which is giving one that way one. So I'm very comfortable, because some artists kind of don't let people look over their shoulders, and they kind of go, I'll show you the drawing when I'm done. I'm very happy to have a director sit next to me, and we'll just sketch together and draw and doodle and stuff. And they all seem to have appreciated that in different regards. But most of the directors I've worked for, in a funny way, my job is to pick their brains and to try to realize their vision and be in sync with them. And I like to think I have reasonably good relationships with all the directors I've worked with. But it is always a puzzle because it's a bit like it is. I suppose the closest one, or the closest two that I was able to kind of almost slightly predict how they're going to be was Ryan.
Mm,
And what I mean is do artwork that I probably knew was going to get through based upon his sensibilities.
mm. You're always looking for that synchronicity. It's not something that
Yeah.
necessarily
So
comes naturally.
not
That's
at the
your job to
beginning.
find.
Yeah, so not at the beginning of the show, but from the middle of the show to the end, I was able to do designs that kind of responded to his description without him needing to say too much. And I was
Mm,
able to go,
mm,
oh, you need one of these for your story. There we go. Because part of it is to try and do something that kind of doesn't take away from the story, that enhances the story, but doesn't bring attention to itself unless it needs to bring attention to itself. And then the other one was the same, was a little bit with getting to, yeah, and again, it comes from familiarity of knowing someone. Was working with Colin on Jurassic, where again, through the middle of a production, it will be a kind of yeah, he's going to go for that one, and then everyone else will go, no, 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 we need Colin will come on, I go, we're doing that, and it's kind of,
yeah, yeah.
but most of it is a case of educated guessing based upon understanding people's needs and the wet and their sensibilities and their likes, I suppose.
Mm, mm. Have you got, I mean, you've worked in so many different genres and periods. Is there a particular genre or period that you kind of would love to get your teeth into from a design point of view?
Well, I've worked on most of them at different periods, but not as a production designer.
Yeah.
I would adore to do a historical epic. Because, in a funny way, as a designer, and I always talk to my agent about this, why are you toning that down, Kev? Because I gravitate to subjects that enthuse me to want to design on them. And so I'm naturally an artist and want to do things that have a little bit of fire in my imagination. So, as a kid that grew up reading Asterix books, then God, give me a Roman temple, I'd fall over and have great fun. And so I've barely scratched the surface, I think, of, I've done a lot of genre because my natural sensibilities in VFX and concept art and art direction have kind of done that. But to be honest with you, and it's really weird because even within genre, you do a lot of subject. Because like within Jurassic and like Star Wars, it's like Jurassic literally had, it was like Raiders of the Lost Ark and about 20 other films put together because it had everything. Planes crashing, dinosaurs, Malta streets, history, modern labs, buildings. It was all, it was everything. And so, you know, it's really weird. I tend to veer towards genre, but I don't mean genre in a science fiction fantasy sense. I mean genre in a kind of, I think my preference is, even if it's contemporary, to have something that has something to kind of create rather
Yeah.
than recreate solely, if that makes sense. I'm not the
Yeah.
right person
Yeah.
to find a country house and put scatter cushions in the corner.
I want that to be the end. I think that's our out point there, Kevin.
Not to take away from those designers. What I mean is, it's just not where my passions lie, and I think I
No,
can
of
do those
course.
jobs, but my passion is to. I think I will get the best out of me, and so would a director if I'm able to kind of help them realize things that have a something I'm passionate about as well, and that always comes from the script and the story. So whenever I read a script, I'm always looking for something to go, oh, I've never done that before, and or I'd love to do that. So it's a hard one because I can only refer to old films because you don't know what new films are going to come, and so I mean, I'd love to have, I don't know, made a Fall of the Roman Empire. I'd love to have made a Close Encounters, which is a contemporary genre project because it has a bit of both. Do you know what I mean? And I'd love to have,
Yeah.
made a yeah. There's all sorts of films like that I kind of am sort of fascinated by. Whereas I also know that
Mm,
as much as I love the firm, I'm not quite sure what I would bring to a project like that, if that makes sense. Even though it will be
mm.
a challenge in a different way that maybe one day I'll be excited about. I don't know. It's a hard one.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation there with Kevin Jenkins. It was great to get those insights into the difficulties of continuing that legacy for certain franchises, particularly when people seem to think that you can just take an unused Ralph McQuarrie design from the archive and just go with that. The vast majority of what Kevin and his team created was from the ground up in those sequel movies. No easy task. Coming up on the podcast, you'll hear my chat with Bill George, VFX supervisor, art director, worked for ILM, worked for Amblin, on Jurassic Park, Back to the Future 2, so many more great films. I've just been ploughing through his drawings recently, and God, they're just mesmerising. And I'm chatting to him later today, actually, so that'll be an episode coming out soon. I also have my interview with ex-ILM camera assistant, Marianne Infield, as well as my upcoming interview with sound professional Victoria Sampson. I rewatched the Making Waves documentary about sound that was out from a few years ago. Victoria's briefly in that as well. I'd recommend you watch that as well. It's very good. And Walter Murch is in there, Mark Mangini's in there, a few of the people that I've had on the podcast. So look out for that sound-related episode coming up soon. Also look out for some exciting news from me on Halloween. I can't wait for you to see it. I can't wait to tell people what I've been doing in the background here. But Halloween, you should see something from me. That maybe you don't expect, but you should enjoy. I hope you enjoy. And remember, you can follow Filmumentaries on Instagram, Threads, Facebook as, quote, Filmumentaries, and on Twitter or X as Jamie SWB. Remember to hit the Linktree link in the show notes if you want to find links to my Return of the Jedi book, buy an Inside Jabba t-shirt, or subscribe to the YouTube channel, or find the Patreon page. It's all there. It's all in that link tree in the show notes. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.